In the anime series Chainsaw Man, based on the original manga, a young man named Denji steps into an underworld of hunting devils and supernatural evil with a team of fellow hunters. The first season, produced by MAPPA Studios in Japan, is a high-level achievement in action and dramatic animation. In this video, we'll look at how the fifth episode creates cinematic shots to visualize the story. Per usual, there will be spoilers to the story of Chainsaw Man, so I recommend checking out the series before proceeding further. As a general story overview, the first 12 episodes of the series reveal the origin story of Denji and his pet devil, Pochita, as Denji discovers a new life hunting devils under the mysterious Makima. Denji is assigned to the stoic Aki while being paired with a wild fiend Power. The team falls in and out of various misadventures as more of the truth behind their operation is unveiled. So when looking at how to make cinematic shots, one place to start is analyzing the composition and figuring out the horizon line, as well as what elements are in the foreground, midground, and background. Lens choice can also be part of the equation. In cinematic shot number 1, the camera is around Denji and Power's waistline tilted upward to capture them in an upshot. Denji's head is actually framed outside of the frame, but we see Power's facial expression as she wraps her arm around him. The shot tells us a lot about Denji's state of mind through the visual of his extended hand in the foreground and with Power being physically close to his body. The background has strong perspective cues indicating the tight space within the bathroom and suggesting a 3-point perspective grid. In cinematic shot number 2, the camera is tilted upward at a Dutch angle, capturing Denji in an upshot where we see most of his upper body and part of his thigh. The lens is likely a wider angle lens, allowing us to see more space within the bathroom, and we can see some of the perspective cues in the background distorted at the edges. We see the source light within the frame, which is the ceiling light at the top above Denji, causing most of his face to be covered in shadow. His extended hands also appear to be larger in proportion to the rest of his body, which can also happen when a wider angle lens is used. In cinematic shot number 3, the camera composes Makima in the foreground on screen left, and she is slightly out of focus to enhance a sense of spatial depth. Denji is in profile view, in the center of the frame, looking downward. The camera lens is likely a little longer, compressing the space between foreground, midground, and background. The source light is the outdoor sunlight pouring through the window on screen right, and this creates a unique light and shadow pattern on the wall behind Denji, while also creating a pattern of stripes on him. With his face in shadow, Denji appears more forlorn, and the window grid shadow pattern on his back and the back of his head helps to create a sense of feeling trapped or pinned down with internal conflict. In cinematic shot number 4, we see an extreme close-up of Denji's eye, where it largely fills up most of the camera frame. Blades of his hair and the side of his head and eyebrows help to give us spatial context, allowing us to identify this eye as belonging to Denji. We can see Makima's reflection in Denji's eye, and interestingly enough, half of her face is brightly lit and the other half is in shadow. There's a strip of shadow from the window grid covering Denji's pupil and iris where we see Makima's reflection, and this helps create a contrast with the brightly lit white areas of Denji's eyes. This strong contrast helps draw our eye to a focus point within the frame. The camera lens is likely a very long lens, allowing us to get closer to Denji's eye. In cinematic shot number 5, the camera is slightly higher above Makima's head, shooting down on Denji and the ground plane. Denji appears smaller in the frame compared to the size of Makima's head, and he is in the top center of the frame. The perspective cues of the wooden floor helps us to see the ground plane. Meanwhile, the perspective cues of the window grid on screen right and the desk on screen left allow us to perceive a 3-point perspective grid within this shot. In cinematic shot number 6, the camera frames the young boy in the middle of the frame in an almost symmetrical composition with the trees and shadows on either side of him. A longer camera lens is likely being used as the distance between the trees and the background are probably compressed a bit. These background elements are also blurred out of focus to create spatial depth and to allow our eyes to focus on the boy in the center. The horizon line shoots across the top of the frame, helping to guide our eyes to the face of the boy. In cinematic shot number 7, Denji appears on screen left of the frame, looking toward a point of focus toward upper screen right, off camera. The window grid pattern helps to section off areas of the background and space within the frame. The outdoor sunlight is the main light source seen within the frame, and it bathes most of Denji's face in light, acting as a key light on him. The outside buildings in the background are slightly out of focus to help create spatial depth. In cinematic shot number 8, the camera is placed shooting toward Denji and Makima using a bookshelf in the center of the frame as a framing element and a foreground element. The shelf is slightly out of focus, creating spatial depth, and it also helps us separate Denji and Makima in 2 different spatial areas within the frame. There are subtle perspective cues shown by the bookshelves on either side of the frame, but generally the space is flattened in this composition. While Denji and Makima face each other in profile views, their spatial orientation is guided by the window pane grid. Outside, there are additional perspective cues formed by the buildings in the background. In cinematic shot number 9, the camera is placed high above the ground, pointed toward Denji and Makima in a down shot. Part of a ceiling lamp sits in the foreground, slightly blurred out of focus to enhance spatial depth, and it acts as another visual element separating Denji and Makima in different areas within the frame. We see the top of Denji and Makima's heads, and the window pane grid helps imply the 3-point perspective grid within the shot. The camera placement and composition of the shot could suggest an almost secretive or voyeuristic quality to the story beat playing out before our eyes. In cinematic shot number 10, Aki stands in the center of the frame, with the backs of Denji and Power in the foreground, both slightly out of focus as foreground elements. We see some details of the background behind Aki, but they're mostly out of focus. The camera lens could be slightly longer than a 50mm lens in order to tighten the composition around Denji and Power and to focus in on Aki. In cinematic shot number 11, we see Aki in the lower corner on screen left, looking toward Himeno, who raises her arm in the foreground. We see the back of Himeno slightly blurred out of focus, and her raised arm acts as a framing element within the composition, putting her and Aki in 2 different spatial areas within the shot. There are fewer dynamic lines within this shot, removing indications of perspective cues, but the blurred background elements help us to get a sense of spatial depth. This likely could be another longer lens used to create this unique composition by flattening the space between foreground, midground, and background. In cinematic shot number 12, Himeno's fingers are used as foreground elements and they're slightly out of focus. The camera is placed slightly higher above her hand, pointed downward toward Denji and Hirokazu. There's a slight 3-point perspective grid within this shot, and the strong perspective lines of the parking lot markings help us to sense the ground plane. The camera lens used in this shot is likely a longer lens, restricting our view of the surrounding environment. In cinematic shot number 13, we see Power, Kobeni, Himeno, and Aki walking through a hallway where their upper bodies appear within the frame. The camera is tilted upwards, showing the ceiling and revealing the strong perspective lines formed by the doorways and pipes in the ceiling. The camera is likely a wider lens so that we can track with the moving characters and allow us to see more of the spatial context. With this composition, the characters appear a little more vulnerable to the environment as they appear smaller in comparison to the wide and tall hallway. These visual cues may help set up later story beats as the characters find themselves in a trap. In cinematic shot number 14, the camera drops closer to the ground and captures Denji and Hirokazu on screen left, almost seeing their whole bodies. The camera is tilted upward to them, allowing us to see the ceiling plane. The other characters are placed further back in spatial depth, a little past midground, so we don't see their facial expressions, just their body language. The rows of doors along the hallway help us to see how far back these characters are from Denji and Hirokazu. The camera lens is likely a wider lens to capture the vast space in the hallway. In cinematic shot number 15, we see the camera very low to the ground, possibly inside part of an open grave, tilted upward so we can see the sky plane. There's a 3-point perspective grid within the shot, and we see Himeno and Aki in 2 different areas of the frame, separated by a cross and gravestone in the foreground, which is slightly out of focus. We don't need to see exact details of Himeno and Aki's faces here because their body language conveys their state of mind. The color scheme is mostly muted with blues, grays, and white tones, creating a somber mood and atmosphere. In cinematic shot number 16, the camera is placed high above the ground, tilted downward, as if it was perched above the pipes in the ceiling. We see our gang of characters walking through the hallway with their backs toward the camera. There's a 3-point perspective grid within the shot, informed by the orientation of the characters and by the perspective cues of the doorways on either side of the frame. In cinematic shot number 17, the camera is placed in front of our gang of characters with Himeno in the center of the frame. The horizon line is higher in the frame, so the camera is slightly above the eye lines of some of the taller characters like Aki. The arrangement of the characters on either side of Himeno reveals some interesting character acting. Aki is solemn on screen right. Meanwhile, the other characters, including Komeni and Hirokazu, appear to be a little more anxious with the developing situation. The camera lens is likely wider to allow for a more expansive view of the hallway space. In cinematic shot number 18, the camera is placed lower and closer to the ground, tilted slightly upward as the remains of a slain devil appear slightly out of focus in the foreground. Spatial depth is also enhanced by the strong perspective lines in the hallway walls and doors and the structural elements of the ceiling at the top of the frame. Komeni appears in the center of the frame, sitting back in horror as she sees the devil in the foreground. We see the lower halves of several other characters behind her, helping us to gauge the spatial orientation of our characters. Himeno and Aki's more stoic body language on screen right contrasts with Hirokazu on screen left, who appears more agitated. We also see repeated source light elements in the background, as seen in the ceiling lights behind Komeni. So overall, these technical descriptions of each shot helps break down the elements of what makes them cinematic. The language of film as shown in composition, lens choice, and camera movement are well executed in this episode to heighten the drama and action.